welcome everybody.
Yeah.
This is our penultimate video this year until, there is one more next month, but that they will be off until September. We have Vasilis Puskas, our friend, colleague, comrade, and he's going to talk about Ukraine and the leadership of globalization now.
What about next time?
Yes, who is the next month?
The next month I will lead a discussion on the impact of result of Turkish elections.
Good.
We don't know what will happen, but whatever happens, we will try to analyze it.
Yeah.
And then in the autumn, I think we hope we are going to start with Mina. When your book is out, Turkey, industrialization in Turkey.
Yeah. It's not going to be out until December. I've just found out, unfortunately.
Okay.
We should review it in the
That'd
journal.
be great. Yeah.
Also in the next journal and also.
I'll let you guys know.
Yeah, when you have the PDF ready, you can start even before publication.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we do that so you can get more publicity.
Right.
When it's out. Already.
Yeah,
Can start, okay? Thank you. Well, it would be good to have something on Turkish selection now, actually. It would be quite, interesting. Interesting, but here we go. This has been arranged something like months ago. So this is what we're going to have today on Ukraine. It won't be a lot of Ukraine because I don't know. I wouldn't say anything, but I don't know. I'm not a Ukrainian expert. I mean, to talk about what? I mean, of what I see happening, and we'll discuss it with Ksenia earlier on, was that this war has created something which did not exist, namely a Ukrainian nationalist movement and strengthened the Ukrainian national identity, whereas before I couldn't see this. I wasn't very visible. That war, Russian invasion, which is illegal, if we go by the book, in the national law, then is illegal, then it kind of created this Ukrainian resistance and nationalism. It's like when the Greeks invaded Asia Minor, when landed in Smyrna, that's immediately, the Turkish nationalism on the back of the Ankara. Bulan got his PhD on that. Not exactly on this, but anyway, this is the two things I'm going to be doing. It is not a humble undertaking, it's quite ambitious, because I'm trying to connect 2-3 levels of analysis. One is the political economy level, which I consider very important to understand why the West is advancing towards the East. Is advancing economically, security-wise or militarily, and this pushes Russia to the corner. And for that, I rely heavily on some analysis by the Monthly Review School, so Marxist school in the United States. Monthly Review. They produce a journal. Yeah. And obviously, I draw from. I'm not in 100% agreement with their views. You will see why. And also my own primary research with Bulan we've done over the years, over the last 20 years, where we published our monographs on the power shift to the East. So what I see is that there is in the West as a whole, the transatlantic area is in a permanent stagnation. The Monthly Review says that the Western economy is in a permanent stagnation since the 70s because they haven't managed to resolve their crisis of overaccumulation. In the 70s, I have a more modest claim. I would say that the most recent stagnation starts with the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, and the present crisis over Ukraine is rooted in the global financial crisis, or if you like, in the crisis of the financialization system that has been built since the 70s, when the Bretton Woods system collapsed and the economies moved from if you like, the real production, the real commodity production to fictitious commodity production. A view that is adopted also by heterodox economists, like post-Keynesians and so on. And that stagnation is what with Boulen we call power shift to the east, because as the west is stagnating and the economies are in a relative decline, relative to what? Relative to what's going on in the east or the global east, which is mostly Asian economies like China, primarily Southeast Asia, moving on to India, of course, and then going further to include other BRICS, as they call them, countries like Brazil or South Africa. I would include Turkey as well as part of this global shift. So what's happening in Ukraine is a chain of events that started with the global financial crisis. Look, this is part and parcel of the problem. Global financial crisis, Eurozone crisis, put in there, if you like, the so-called Arab Spring, put there then, if you want, Brexit, okay? The pandemic is definitely there, and now you have Ukraine, massive disruption in global supply chains and in global financial system, massive disruption, and this is at the roots of it. This is what is produced the inflation, as we'll see later on. The media, you read BBC, you read newspapers say, oh, you know, Ukraine war is responsible for the events. No, it's not. I checked the data. I mean, the price of oil and gas in January 2022, before the invasion, it was higher than it is today, or in January 2023. Because Russia and Ukraine have nothing to do with the inflation. Inflation is rooted in the inability of supply, of the aggregate supply, to generate development and growth in the West. There is massive productivity crisis in the West. Labor productivity is very low. Every data I check. I'll show you a few, because there's no point of just showing various things. And there is a crisis of globalization. Yes, there is a crisis of globalization in all this. It goes hand in glove with a disruption in global supply chains and the efforts made by the West to address the issue of climate change. So the West somehow wants to reroute, what I call reroute globalization, to change the way that things are operating and to have green technology and green development. This is what they want to do. But for that to happen, they need this type of thing, what they call at the end, rare earth elements. First time I heard this about rare earth elements was by this gentleman next to me. We were writing a book about the fall of the US empire in 2011, 2010, when was it? 2012. And I received a chapter, because we're exchanging chapters, we write chapters, saying China is producing rare earth elements and this is very important for the to have for the mobile phones, for semiconductors and so on. The first time I heard this from him, I also got the credit because we published the book together. But you see, now I start working on that with this new green text, and I say nothing can be done without this new raw materials. It's like what oil and gas was at the beginning of the 20th century. Honestly, this is how my feeling is, because when I see the British government producing so many calls, funding calls about wanting to have green energy production, green maritime industry, everything green, green, green. At the bottom of this all is this: rare earth elements and minerals. They can't do anything without that. And the main producer in the society, the state that mines those things, extracts them and mines them and refines them, is primarily China. China is the main producer of all this. And accidentally I found out also the Donbas region in Ukraine is very rich in those things. So it's no wonder why Russia is so much into Donbas region. Yeah? Now, elements of stagnation of this thing. I will just first go to the classic. It's Marxist here. Okay. I mean, I don't think Adam Smith would have had a problem with that. Yeah, the author of the Wealth of Nations. this is, look, there are so many interpretations about the rate of profit, and there are disagreements in the definition of the rate of profit, but roughly speaking, every author I checked and the way they measure it, roughly agree on that. Like people like Robert Brenner, as a serious economist from UCLA, somebody to be taken seriously, right? Another guy who spent a lot of time working on all their lives, working on the rate of profit. I'm nobody compared to them to have my own metrics on that. After all, I'm not exactly expert to start doing this. So I'm taking it from them, something which is accepted by all of them, although they have their disagreements in the mathematics, but yeah, I'm not bothering with that. It's not a problem. This is the general trend, which is what matters. It's the general trend. We had the golden age of capitalism. That all economic historians, Hobsbawm agrees on that term. Yeah, we had, this is the golden age of capitalism. We had high rates of growth, 6, 7, 8, 9%. 10% Japan had at some point in the 60s, early 60s. The golden age of capitalism. Paradoxically, you had low inflation, you had high wages, which was fantastic for everybody. In my PhD supervisor used to say, if capitalism is doing well, everybody's doing well. The working class is doing well, everybody's happy. If capitalism is doing well, everybody's happy. This is a typical social democratic view, right? Why should we shout on the streets? We're doing well. We have high wages, we buy, no inflation. Perfect system. We don't want anything else. Why, why so much fuss? Why French trade unions go to ask for what? All this stuff. So this is it. Then we had the profitability crisis of the 70s. This is the crisis of under-accumulation I was talking about. With the fall of the end of the dollar-gold parity, the kind of neoliberal recovery in the 80s and under the Clinton years, which goes until the 2007. And then the long depression, as they call it, so stagnation. Then when I check the GDP growth in the West, then even during the neoliberal recovery, the GDP growth could not match the GDP growth during the golden age of capitalism. So neoliberal capitalism, supply-side economics, cannot produce growth. They are not conducive to growth. Whatever definition of growth you may have, you define it as development even. Development include education, if you like, they include fertility rates, include all these demographics. No way. There is a massive demographic crisis in the West. Massive. And they expect immigrants to solve the problem. But demography is an issue for the West. Something which is not the case in Asia, overall, generally speaking. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Global rate of profit down. GDP rates. We will see a few more GDP stuff in a bit. Inflation. Yeah, I talked earlier about inflation. Here, this is my own graph. I produced that. I mean, you can see clearly, inflation started picking up during the pandemic, 2020. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. War. There was no Ukraine at the time. Ukraine came after 2-3 years, after 3 years, 2 years. There's nothing. So the inflationary trend is embedded in Western political economies and the breakup of global supply chains, which happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic, you could not find parts of the car if your car had a problem. Still is a problem, and this had to do again with the rare earth elements and minerals. British industry is running, car industry is going out, is leaving. Vauxhall is closing factories again. Vauxhall, why? Because they cannot afford this new green tech, the rerouting of all this to green tech development. They cannot afford it. The long-term causes of the inflation lie in the inability of the aggregate supply to generate growth. And so this inflationary trend is not the same with the 70s. It's nothing to do with the 70s. The 70s, you may say there was a demand problem. You had a Keynesian state, you had high wages, you can call it whatever it was a demand-based inflation. This inflation is based on supply-side inflation. Therefore, That's when I read the evening standards and say the interest rates rise will go high. I wonder if these people expect to treat inflation, which is generated from the supply side, with monetary means, without using fiscal means to tackle inflation. I don't think they will be successful, you know. I have serious doubts that they can solve the inflation problems with interest rates hikes, simply because the root of the inflation is different from what it was in the 70s. In the 70s, we had this guy, what's his name, Volcker, the Volcker shock, 19% interest rates overnight, went to 19%. It killed wages, it killed inflation, it killed them all. What are these guys are doing? I don't know. I'm very pessimistic, and I have a mortgage to pay, unlike others. So, the other thing I checked was the rate of investment, which is a very important indicator. I don't have, I checked it last night of my toothache. So I said, I'm going to make it today or not? I need to know. Rate of investment in Russia, 31% of GDP reinvested. Turkey, 33%. China, 43%. But the United States have just 20% rate of investment. Germany has 23%. And the UK only 16% rate of investment. This is so important indicator, guys, for capitalism, to move forward, to promote growth. If you don't invest, what the hell are you doing in your life? You know, this is it. I know it has to be adjusted to inflation, this and that. I understand all that, but the trend is that the West again is in stagnation. Even with that indicator of rate of investment. This is my graph. You can see China's share increases over time. The USA decreases. This is a GDP growth. China's share of global GDP is going up and up and up slowly, and the United States is decreasing. You know, you can see the dates. The USA, I have it since 1960. In years since 1960, it's going down. It's going down. Okay, it's going down. You tell me, of course, we'll have an issue can be raised as to how you measure your GDP. Don't go there. I mean, we know that. We know there are many issues of measuring GDP because they include all sorts of things that classical economy were not including. They include consumption, for example, and in GDP they include all sorts of things, but you know, that is the, take it as it is there, because it's far more complicated to discuss further, this thing. I'm now going to look at another indicator about the wage growth and inflation, which is quite pertinent for our times, for today. Okay, the trade unions are trying to have the same. You know, if you have rate of inflation which is 6%, trade union will increase in wages 6%, so to balance, you know, the cost of living thing and so on. So here you see that inflation everywhere but the United States is everywhere higher than the wage growth. Do you understand? So look, the EU average, you have inflation 11.1%. These are data two months ago. So this is quite recent, you know. 11.1%. But the wage growth is 5.2%. Wherever you look at France, inflation 6.8%, wage growth 0.9%. It's no wonder why the French are on the streets, for example. In Germany, the same. Only the United States fares better than the rest of let's call it West, transatlantic economies. Put it this way, although Japan has nothing to do with Atlantic. It's part of the Western coalition, isn't it? Now, if you now keep that in mind, and look at this now. We produced a different thing in Asia. This I adjusted to inflation, and you can see the real wage increases everywhere but Thailand. But Thailand will catch up. In 2023 is forecasted to have a wage increase 2.2 above inflation. So everywhere in Asia, wage growth is higher than inflation. It tells me that these countries' economies are more dynamic. That's what it tells me. Okay? When we can, you know, cross-check data there, that, you know, they're reliable. So, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, if you measure the GDP and you compare GDP, Chinese GDP with American GDP, in terms of purchasing power parity, then China is ahead of the United States in terms of purchasing power. Okay, I finished with this political economy stuff, and I'm going now to briefly about some geopolitics and the disruption of what happened with the oil and gas pipeline system in Eurasia, call it Eurasia, I mean Europe and Russia effectively, and Central Europe and Ukraine. I don't want you to believe, because I haven't read anything contrary to that, I don't want you to believe that every flow of oil and gas has stopped connecting Russia with Europe. Still things are happening. I don't know, correct me here, something still is going, some oil and gas is going to Europe. It's not, that's
no, first of all, Ukraine supplies.
Ukraine, yes.
Yeah, through Ukraine.
Through Ukraine. Usually it's operational. Yeah, I have another one. But also some tankers through the Black Sea, I think they're moving around, you know, something. But there is a disruption, massive disruption, also because of sanctions and so on and so forth. So this has to do with how the global system was working, and now is upset. It's upset. It's not like it used to be. It's something is in a major crisis. And if you factor into that, and to the next, you know, that's the northern, yeah, southern, yeah. If you factor now into this, the disruption of Chinese business and the Belt and Road Initiative in this area, because all the Balkans, Turkey, Greece, and etc., Central Europe are part of Belt and Road Initiative. It starts from, you know, and goes through from Pakistan, and there's a Belt and Road, has a maritime road and a land route. Do you understand that the war is a major disruption of this, of Chinese economic penetration into Europe? There are, of course, new regulations and new instructions by the US government for not giving any assets to China. The Chinese are not allowed to buy assets in Europe or in Australia. I think we got that in our book, remember? In our book, in the last book, we saw that. I mean, actually Financial Times was reporting this a lot, about how Australian government blocked the acquisition of XYZ assets, because why did they block it? Well, they need a lot of money. This is under instructions by the United States. Similarly, in Germany, they blocked that. So now this is, I mean, if the Chinese were now to buy the shares at the Piraeus port, probably the European Union would have said, you don't give the Piraeus port to Chinese any state. I mean, this is my guess. Yes, supply chains cannot work without the steady flow of hydrocarbons. This is true, but now, so this shows the dependency of Europe upon Russian oil and gas, and this is what the Americans wanted primarily to achieve, to stop this dependency of Europe on Russian oil and gas. You all know the famous piece by Seymour Hersh in Substack. I'm not going to quote, we wrote an article with Alan about that. We're not quoting Seymour Hersh, but you know, it's something like the English say, ever say, like, you know, it walks like a duck, looks like a duck, but sounds like a duck, but it's a duck. Who did it? Who did the northern, blew up the pipelines there? I mean, the Russians have any vested interest to do that? Come on. I mean, but we're not saying these things, but we're here in a friendly, comradely environment, we can say that. So all this is to reroute globalization, to reroute the supply of oil and gas for Russian to American natural liquefied gas, the LNG. But the LNG, to come to Europe, it's an entirely new operation. It needs, because all the European, the reception of European gas was through pipelines basically. LNG requires the building of very, you know, special terminals, ports, and special tankers. I have further down even how they look like, and the people who runs the tank, the top of the tankers are Greek ship owners. I have some evidence about this, but that's unimportant. But it's quite interesting when I look at it. Which fleet is moving the American LNG to Europe? It's Greek ship owners, mostly, and then it's Japanese, Norwegian, and so on. But to create that infrastructure in Europe takes time. It will take 2-3 more years to build this infrastructure in Europe. Anyway, and then the new talk now goes to this. This is the rare earth element story. The map is not inaccurate, but it needs updating. It needs updating because it doesn't include many countries. Central Africa, for example, they found rare earth elements and minerals. In India, they have been found. Even here in England, I read in Financial Times recently that they found some of this. But still, the major producer and supplier is China, and the United States are furious about this because Chinese government is not controlled by Western interests. There's no, you know, they have to bargain, they have to give something to take something, and I'm talking about, you know, these elements are, which I don't know, I'm not a geologist, but I can, you probably have heard of them. Without lithium, for example, lithium batteries, you cannot have, I think you are close to this discipline.
Closer.
Closer, exactly. They tell us more. I don't know about nickel, the platinum group metals, cobalt, right? Graphite, lithium, batteries, you know, the gadgets, the phones, electric cars, military technology and all that. I mean, it cannot happen without them. Yes, and I've read the report, the 2021 OECD report, the role of critical minerals in clean energy production. OECD report is so fundamental. The role of critical minerals in clean energy production. So yes, that is something. This is the future. Let's see. Like the oil was the future when they found the oil, and the British Navy could not work without oil in the early 20th century to have the First World War without oil resources. Similar is today, if we accept it, because there are some people who don't accept that there is any issue with global warming or climate change. They don't accept that. But you know, if I see official policies all about this now, the semiconductor industry, I think there must be something into that. I'm coming to an end in a bit. This is the penultimate slide. How does the West deal with its own crisis, with its own stagnation, with its own problems, and so on? I think Macron encapsulated in the best way this. What is the response? Is war. And he says, as France, you know, we must never be one war late. Can you believe that phrase? When I read it, we must never be one war late. We must be ahead by one war. So this is typical bandwagoning, what we call international relations. You know, you ride on the bandwagon of the strongest power, which is the United States, in order to, you hope that you're going to win and you're going to get some parts of the spoils when you win. You know, this is the West, what the West is doing. The war in Ukraine increased massive spending under the, you know, they pushed the United States, they pushed the governments to invest more in their defense, which is now well above 2% of GDP. This war, obviously, this doesn't need any proof or any major analysis. Is creating massive profits for the defense industry and the pharma industry. Big pharmacy are very much into that game. You must have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. These are considered as semi-protectionist measures by the United States. And the Chips and Science Act, which is how to bring back the semiconductor industry to the United States. My gut feeling is, and I have it for a long time with Bülent, I think, is that we're in a very long and protracted interwar period, something like that. They will try to scale back globalization for some reason. They have to reroute globalization. They have to scale it back. And we're at the scaling back, but the scaling back globalization is going not without major consequences that concern global peace. That is my pessimistic conclusion, and it comes to mind the smooth and holy tariff law, which is the United States started the tariffs, raising tariffs. It was not Germany, it was not Hitler, it was the United States, the democratic liberal United States, to protect its own industry in the interwar period in 1930. It started earlier, but that was a major, policy when they introduced that law. I talked about the other bullet point. Yes, the final is that European industry has been devastated by all this. In the last article we published with Alan Kafruni, from Hamilton College in the United States, you read it. BASF is the largest chemical fertilizer conglomerate in the world. Downsized, moved to China. Who is losing? European Union. I mean, as a Greek, so if I put my Greek hat on, I'm very happy what happened to Germany with this war, because Germany has been humiliated, because they humiliated the Greeks with a bailout agreement something like 5-10 years, whatever years. Since 2010, 5 years of negotiations, they humiliated us, you know, who are you to negotiate with us, etc. And look what happened to Germany now.
And even Volkswagen.
Even Volkswagen, yes.
Certain facilities into China.
Into China, yeah, of course, it will continue. And some other, also financial services are going there, I read recently. Yeah, but that is a trend. This is all part of the global picture, which I call rerouting of globalization. But before the rerouting is established as a new international and social order, it will be a scaling back of the existing globalization, and which is happening already since 2007, 2008. And in that interim period, which Gramsci and Bülent also would call as the monsters period, or the morbid symptoms, right? This period will be very prolonged, very long, and during that period we may have, I hope we don't, we may have a global war. Yes, this is it basically. That's my presentation. This is summing up of what we already discussed and what we said. Yes, so the leadership of globalization is the war Russia versus NATO. The war is pretty much against China. I mean, they're putting the flesh on the ground there, the Ukrainians and the Russians with the Ukrainians with Western gear, military gear, and the people are killed, but the USA has its eyes on China. That is a major enemy. And yeah, this is pretty much what I had to say, but I'm sure I'm going to discuss more, various things that I have myself doubts still how this is going to end up. I see no end in the horizon because there is escalation. There's escalation. The West provides more and more weapons. The entire NATO are providing more and more military supplies to Ukraine. When is this going to end?
Thank you, Vasilis. This is very enlightening, and we have lots of material to discuss.
Yeah.
Now let's have how many minutes? 5 minutes break for tea and coffee, and then we can continue with questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Who would like to start?
Yeah. How would you see this sort of crisis will end? The Russian and the Ukraine war, how will it end? Can you see it ending soon, or it will drag on for longer, much longer?
No, I don't think it will end soon. Unfortunately, this is what I see. I took with me to read on the train the Kissinger's interview in The Economist. I didn't manage to probably this guy, his 100th birthday, he will have something to say. I don't know, have you read it, Bülent? Because he has a prognostication usually who is more valid than mine or any. But as I see things now, I don't think because Russia is not going to give Crimea back. It's not going to give back what it conquered, the force of arms. I mean, no state without defeat in war gives back territory that conquered. I don't know any case in history that happened. Militarily to defeat Russia, I think, is unrealistic, unless if you have a global war. I mean, even that would be what? I don't know how this. Perhaps they have a problem to find an exit. All parties have a problem to find an exit out, find a way out of all this mess. They have plans. The West has plans to break up Russia.
Oh, right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because Russia has many parts, many nationalities somewhere here and there, but Russia is not Yugoslavia. It's not going to happen.
Just that maybe they want to break up China.
As if Putin doesn't know that. Of course they know that. We all know that. It's just they don't say it. But some...
I mean, they say openly.
Yeah.
In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who used to be President Carter's security advisor, and even after that he became one of the leading advising figures in the United States. The administration always looked at it. He published a book in 1997, The Grand Chessboard, the main title, and there's a long title. It's all about Eurasia, how the dominant power in Eurasia should act. And in that book, he very clearly says, after the Cold War, Russia was weakened, and the conditions for the United States emerged for the first time to be the leading power in Eurasia. And then he says, again after a few pages, this could be achieved through NATO. And he even says that we should get all the countries around Russia, former socialist countries, into NATO, and we should go closer and closer to Russian borders. And as a result of all this pressure, Russia may be divided into 3 republics. He even specified this. One European republic, one, I think, Siberian or the Northern Republic, and one in the center. So 3 republics, and then it will be easier to deal with Russia. I mean, that book was published in 1997, and still now, if you type the title of that book, the first thing comes, CIA website, they put the whole book in the CIA website. So it is still there. I mean, this is almost like a plan before coming to today.
What's the title of this book?
It is The Grand Chessboard.
The Grand Chessboard.
Grand Chessboard.
Chess,
and then
yeah,
there's
chess.
a long title, something like
Geostrategy, something.
Geostrategy in Eurasian land or something like that.
Okay.
And his name is Zbigniew Brzezinski.
All right, I probably when I
Google the correct, you know where it is.
Yeah, oh God, yes,
He is
right,
one
okay.
of the smaller gods in the American foreign politics.
Okay,
He
right.
is important.
I mean, I know all this because when in one of my classes I teach international relations of Eurasia,
Yeah.
and one of the assessment for the students, I give them a number of books saying that just choose one of them and write a book review. This is one of the books. I always ask them to understand what's happening in Eurasia today.
Yes, interesting, yeah.
Very
I
good.
mean, there are losers now, isn't it? You can see the West, we are suffering because of this war. I mean, it doesn't seem to affect America so much. But we have, you know, whether we want to get dragged into it. But Germany, I heard on the news, now become the sick man of Europe. Really?
Yeah.
What's going on here? I'm sure they won't be happy with that thing.
What was that?
And I couldn't agree more with Vasilis because, you know, when Putin invaded Crimea,
Yeah.
it took 7 years before he invaded Ukraine. And what did the West do in the meantime? Nothing. So it's obvious. And I think, what's his name, last seminar speaker,
Tunç, yes.
Tunç, he said it quite well. He said that comparing Putin with Erdogan, that Putin is a chess player. He does 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You know, he looks at the boards, whereas Erdogan is a backgammon player. He just throws the dice.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be so. I'm not convinced that Putin has played a particularly clever game in the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, look at what he originally did. He invaded from Belarus from the north. What was that all about? He obviously had the vision that he'd take Kiev and then be able to dispose of Ukrainian territory as he wanted to. But even in those early days of the battle, the Russian forces weren't able to achieve what he intended then. So what they've retreated from the ambitions that they had at that stage and got bogged down in a war which isn't going anywhere at all. I think this the invasion of Ukraine has played to the Americans in lots of ways. They've been able to unite the EU and NATO behind them. They've been able, so as far as the what you call the transatlantic nations are concerned, he's been able to the Americans have been able to cohere them to a much greater extent than they were before. I think you're right that the key geopolitical struggle is with China rather than Russia, and the Americans obviously in the last decade have switched their tactics towards China, previously seeing it as an area where US corporations could invest, make big profits, extract surplus value and so on. And even in this country, the 2010 to 15 government was all about a new opportunity for a relationship with China, and Xi Jinping was over here in a pub and everything. So there's been a switch in just the last few years. Trump kind of began it in a way, but Biden obviously has not stepped back from the Trump took a protectionist, mercantilist position that we want to get industry back to the United States. You've explained extremely well how Biden is doing exactly the same thing. So this I think what's changed in terms of the US relationship with China in the last decade and a half or so is that Chinese corporations have begun to step onto the world stage, and Huawei and all of that. So, you used to hear the argument in the first decade of this century that China can't become a world hegemon because it doesn't have its own brands, it doesn't have its own corporations and so on. That's begun to dramatically change recently, and that's why I see the United States is determined to block that development, and that's what with Huawei, with the block on chips, which, given the importance of these chips in the world economy, that's a blockade. That's tantamount to a declaration of war on China. And if China doesn't have, and it gives China a huge motivation to go after Taiwan, obviously, with the most advanced productions of microchips are there in Taiwan, on its doorstep, in territory which, frankly, the whole world sees as being Chinese. That's the diplomatic acceptance. So I think you're quite right to say there's huge dangers in the coming period of time. But to some extent, I think since the invasion of Ukraine, has put the United States and the West on the front foot. Russia's proven incapable of making any more advances from the territory which it's taken in Ukraine now. And the longer they're bogged down there, the more material, the more forces in that Russia's going to have to put into that. And the Western countries are putting very limited, equivalent, as much smaller proportion of their resources into it, and none of their men or soldiers. Ukrainians are fighting and dying in order to pursue US and Western interests in Russia and so on. So it's an ideal position as far as the United States is concerned. On the other side, the West hasn't been able to consolidate the whole world. The global South is is equivocating over the whole thing, and the Russians and the Chinese have been able to begin to get the BRICS on side, and the BRICS are expanding and so on. So it's a global contest which we're seeing, but the outcome isn't. We're not going to see a clear outcome in the next year or two, I would have thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Russian leadership wanted to occupy militarily the whole of Ukraine. I don't think there was such a plan.
They could take the capital though, and then take the territory they're trying to occupy now.
I'll talk about that in a second.
The Russian side also is not just one man deciding on everything individually, single-handedly. It's not like it's not Putin there just playing chess and doing this, doing that. I just want to mention, I'm sure many of you heard this, there's a group called Izborsk Club. Yeah, Izborsk Club. It was established in 2012 in that city, and that city is symbolically is very important, like one of the most ancient and impressive fortresses are there. And I think in earlier centuries against German knights, they won some victory there. So in terms of the Russian nationalist mentality, it's an important place. And in that particular club, a large group of people came together. Russian Orthodox Church, Russian nationalists wanting to bring the Tsarist period back, some extreme Stalinists, and some opportunistics, and some of them like owns major newspapers. And one of Putin's closest advisors was in that meeting, foundation meeting as well. So all these groups and people, they were it was kind of a coalition, but they were also putting pressure on the government. So Putin was probably trying to maneuver in between these things. He didn't go to the club and he didn't become a member, but he was close distance through his links and advisors. And I mean, when they got the Crimea, for instance, the EASDALE club had their major meeting in the palace, Livonia, in Crimea. One of the major palaces played an important role during the First World War, for instance. Again, all these meetings are symbolically important and preparing ground and pushing the administration in one direction. I don't think, I agree with Vasilis, I don't think Putin himself particularly was happy with how the war started and continued, but again, just like in any other major state, there wasn't only one single person, one single political figure running everything.
Yeah.
Also, what is very clear is that that mistake that happened, this kind of a, which, as you say, played well for the benefit of the United States and for all the plans. Actually, the reaction that happened at the time of invasion in Europe was modest in a sense, but in UK was kind of the spirits went up. And at the time I traveled to a conference in the United States and I could see they were so happy. And I was like shocked. I was like, how can you be happy when countries are at the brink of war? They say, yeah, but they are actually achieving our objective for us. This is one point which actually raises very big ethical question of like waging war, kind of all this proxies war by, as you say, not sending your troops. But this is not actually right, that, and also it also correlates with the argument that you supply this weaponry, but there is no one who actually can operate, you need to train. For example, to this new tanks that are in operation now, they're supplied, it takes minimum 3 months just to familiarize a guy who hasn't already been trained on other equipment. So it takes at least 3-5 years from the scratch. I mean, if you take someone not professional in operating those tanks. So it takes lots of time in preparation of this like high-valued staff and personnel. But what happens with the armies now that it's not, we still, people who are not really follow what's happening in contemporary warfare, they think, oh, we're still thinking this like national army mindset. Now there is not such thing as national army. There is very limited number. If you look at official statistics of the numbers of official personnel, they're not that many. What they do, they outsource a lot. So what we encounter in Ukraine, and increasingly, that there are lots of outsourcing staff and military personnel, highly equipped, highly trained, coming to fight. So they are not Ukrainians. There are lots of guys who are not Ukrainians anymore. So it's all outsourcing. But it also raises an important question of how you can actually control what's going on the ground. So you provide this weapon, you have this outsourcing intelligence sources and associated armies. But what happens next? What will be happening to these arms? There will be a newly created black markets for this armament. There will be newly created centers of instability around, not only in Ukraine, it will spill over all around the region. It actually causes massive problem in the surrounding regions. Also, these new weapons and technologies that go really, all these drones, now actually dealing with warfare and conducting warfare is an easy thing. It's like a bunch of terrorists can hijack it and try to achieve their own objectives. As with Putin, why he was doing this stupid march, yeah, to Kiev, from all the kind of a military sense, what was happening? As most military experts believe that this was a problem, and this problem actually occurs in most states which have hierarchical, really subjugated control and command, when intelligence services are actually, even when they contain information that they want to report to their commander, they're scared of doing so, because they only report what they want, what they think their boss wants to hear. And I think if some senior officials were already keeping this in mind, that this will be good kind of advancement for the military operation, they wouldn't get proper information from the ground. That's the problem. Also, this kind of a communication within intelligence services be a big problem now. Because also what happened recently over the last 10 years, big with this huge shift in technologies, all the like old means of communicating, all means of putting lots of effort in intelligence service on face-to-face contact, on human, they call human intelligence, more like into technical sphere, which is proper chaos. No one knows who controls what. There is information war. They get all these sources from the open sources, information. They can't analyze it properly. But if they can analyze it properly, they cannot report it properly. If they can report it properly, then there is very like slow reaction to this proper report. That's another problem of communication with the intelligence sources, because with all this information chaos, with the like rising technologies, we're shrinking, sinking, as we see as societies, in this information chaos, noise.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ismail first.
I was just going to make a comment on his comment. Before I came here, I have searched Google on Ukraine maps, which shows linguistic distribution and population, what you call population characteristics. Now, Russians are at those places today, which was historically Russian-speaking, fully Russian-speaking, integrated. They are not in the so-called Ukrainian-speaking, Ukrainian population parts, except Odessa and Kharkiv. They are where the map says the Russian speakers or predominantly Russian population have been. So in that sense, whatever they call operation, I call it war, they are successful because they are exactly there where they wanted to be. So that is one thing. Concerning the China versus America, I think we sometimes exaggerate the position and power of Chinese against the Americans. Chinese are doing what Americans are not doing, or Western world are not doing, which is investment, real investment in the infrastructure of capitalism. China or Russia as a capitalist country, they do the menial jobs, so to say. What? They are building a train from Mogadishu to somewhere inland in Africa. Or they are building airport and shoe factory in Ethiopia. They are doing what the Western capitalists are not doing. They are not investing there. They are in the process of financialization. They are investing in the money. But those countries, all the Belt and, what was it called?
Belt
and Road project countries, all of them need desperately infrastructure. They need dams, bridges, roads, railroads, factories, airports and so on, which capitalism is supposed to do, but they don't do it. So in that sense, China is filling the void left from the Western powers. So in that sense, I do not think that Americans or Western powers think China is threatening, because they like it. We don't take this job, let the Chinese do it, they say. But when the Chinese started their own internet, own software, own semiconductors, when they had good relations with Taiwan, then all the alarm bells started ringing because Americans don't want the Taiwanese getting too, how do you say, into warm relations with the Chinese. But even today, when Americans started banning all semiconductor production and export to China, even now, they say, some articles say that more than 50,000 Taiwanese engineers are working in China. 50,000 software and hardware engineers. It is an army. They can create many things. That is what Americans do not want. So, yes, there will be American intervention this or that way against China, just because of this, not because they are in Latin America making roads, creating highways and so on. I think capitalism needs to do all this infrastructure. Somebody's got to do it. Chinese are voluntarily doing it as, how do you say, doing menial jobs, so to say, I think.
To say anything?
Yeah, they do that, but that's just, if you consider that capitalism as an abstraction, complete abstraction, I agree with you, but if you see it as something that is concretized through politics and influence, political influence, I think it's wrong, because when they buy a Serbian factory, recently they bought one, they saved 5,000 jobs. They increased their influence on Serbia, and the Americans don't want that. It's a lot that comes to politics rather than to capitalism as an abstraction, or capital, if you like, as an abstraction. Capital, as examined by Marx in Capital, has this big defect in my view. And in that respect, I'm not a Marxist. I think you have to inject politics into capital to understand what's going on in the world.
I think they should stop listening to him anymore.
I find things. This, by the way, is the tanker that needs to bring LNG, American LNG gas to Europe. Look how it looks like. These are new, okay, completely different from the previous one, and they start building it over the last 5 to 10 years. And the Greek shipowners, and this is one part of infrastructure, and the other is the terminal. I don't have a photo of the terminal, but imagine something similar. So, and this is the who dominates the LNG market. Greece, Japan, China is the third. Yeah, and South Korea, Norway. Interesting, huh?
So I was right, recently
It's a shipping market.
Yeah, that's the source is vessels value is the most reliable source.
Why didn't you put Erdogan's son? Because he has a couple.
But this is it, what I say. That's what I'm saying. Do not give capital the definition you gave. This is an abstraction to work with abstract instruments, which is fun to build, to construct a science and a model or whatever. But those people here that are on the top, many Greek Marxists say this is the ruling class of Greece, which I consider completely bollocks. I'm sorry for the expression. I cannot hear that. These people there are completely integrated into US system of power. Totally. They don't give a damn what's happening in Greece or Cyprus or Greek-Turkish relations or any of this in the Balkans, whatever. Nothing. These are. Go to Cardiff and you walk on the board there and you will see Greek, these are the people. Those are these people. They don't care anything. When the Greeks were most influential in Washington, D.C., when was the most influential? They had the vice president. Yeah, Spiro Agnew. They had Onassis. They had, what was the other guy who was involved in Watergate? These are all Greek. So when did Turkey invade Cyprus? Exactly that period. They don't care. The capital is something else. Nothing to do with this. In other respects, that I'm turning around this to say about how capital is an abstraction. You are saying that Chinese capital is functional to American capitalism. If you bring the state in it won't work like that. But Greek state does not have this capacity. It's not nothing.
So you are saying that Greece is not a big power?
Imagine. I mean, honestly, there are Marxists in Greece, as we speak now, that they believe that Greece is an imperialist power. The country was taking bailout agreements with Germany. Millions, the major Althuserian Marxist.
I met him in your...
You met him?
Yes.
He was I like him. He's a very nice guy. He's a friend of mine. But when he starts talking, I cannot hear him. I cannot understand. Well, you say that Greece is an imperialist. Where is it? We have, what is the capital? The banks penetrated, the Greek banks that penetrated the Balkan markets were all capitalized with the euro, with the European banks. They had just the Greek name because they were selling good to Serbs, because they are good. So they were penetrating the... you wanted to say something?
So
No, I have a question.
Oh, you had a question? Well, good.
We have three people. First Imran, and then you. And
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
Imran.
Well, actually, I will start saying something about war.
Yeah.
Once somebody asked Einstein, do you think that the Third World War will be? And then the guy said, this is a true story actually. Well, I don't know whether there will be a Third World War. But what I know, if there is a Fourth World War, it will be done with the arrow and
Yes.
it is very meaningful actually, especially now we are threatened with the climate change, and the war is contributing to that, as well as resource and human resource. It's not an option really. There are a huge amount of people dying, and at this point of time died as well.
Yeah.
So, who is in the scene are all in the frame of capitalist production, capitalist mode of production. So, once upon a time, I'm speaking about the 1960s, 70s, at least in my country, our word 20–25% was heard by the quite majority, but now no one hears us. So there is something going on that we all need to object. But what we were just the last couple of 5–10 minutes were discussing, the impossibility of it, because the humans are changed. I mean, on us is don't worry about this issue. There's no militant aspect of it, almost my country, and I will do this and that. But there are some people like the Ukrainians, they are pumped and they become maybe. And when I look at the last election, which is not finalized yet, there's 2–3 days, actually the Turkish nationalist three-party, between them took a huge vote, nearly 30%. No one noticed that. So in certain countries, the nationalism become very strong, and but when we look at the globalization of the global powers' influence, it's not important. They are like a puppet. Okay, we know, but the majority doesn't know. And who influenced them? The Americans and the Europeans. they still use the propaganda machine and make them to convince. But we can't, we don't. But we need to think about it. What can we do? How can we do? There is some pro and some negative things. The most negative things is the mind of the younger people, etc., changed completely. But at the same time, there is the media, people are moving one place to another, and let's say some people left the university, came to Britain. They are individuals, they are lost. But if there was organizations that they were talking, speaking, planning, etc., that would be a force.
But Imran, are you asking this to a guy? You just said that he's not a Marxist.
I'm sorry, but thank you very much for stuff. It was like an excellent. You show it to us, and also contributors, and your contribution and his contribution and everybody's contribution was very good. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking to all of us. What can we do? We need to start to think, plan, do something. I mean, for example, you are giving this seminar to us. That's part of it.
Thank you. Let's say that.
Okay, first you, and then Ksenia and Amina.
Right. In relation to what Ismail said before, which I don't disagree with, but China cannot extend its influence in the way that the US does. I don't know whether you've seen the film by John Pilger, the Australian journalist, The Coming War on China. It's a very useful film, and it's basically what it says is there are 400 US bases around China, 400. And there are, if you look in the details, I'm not sure whether this, the next thing is on the film, but if you look at the details, about a decade ago, there was a major naval exercise, Australia, UK and the US, how to block the Malacca Straits, because a lot of the Chinese trade passes through the Malacca Straits next to Malaysia. So they're doing things like that for a very long time, and China is already encircled in that sense. Now, I'm not saying there'll be a war tomorrow or next decade or anything like that, but they have capabilities there, and the Chinese know that. And what the Chinese have done in return, they've established the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which there's many countries involved in that, but they haven't done any major bold steps so far. I think I'm correct in that.
Yeah.
Now, and perhaps the US is trying to do the same thing about to encircle Russia, but it's a little bit difficult because it's not controlling definitely the biggest border of Russia. But it's starting to do whatever it can. Now, recently, they opened up a new naval base in Androupoli in Greece, in the north of Greece, out of nowhere. Now, they put in there ships, planes, and so on. That makes Greece a prime target. It's the nearest point to Russia in Greece. I mean, it's right in the north. And it's a different type of influence they're exerting. So, other than the economic muscle, they're doing this. China cannot do that. Cannot go and start open a base in Africa. But they build a port, and it gets preferential terms to use that port. So that's as far as they can go.
Yeah, it has one base in Africa, Djibouti,
Yeah.
I think. There's one military base, but that's it. And also the way China distributes money around the world is completely different than the way IMF does it, or the World Bank. They're different. One of the difficulties I had in my work, and doing this discussing the big question is if China can be classified as an imperialist power. That is a difficult question. I think it's easy, but it's not.
Chinese are discussing that as well.
Yeah.
In 2018, I was at a conference.
Yes.
And David Harry was there, Samir was there, and all Chinese big names were there. And there was one major debate in that conference. Like something like 2,000 people came to listen. David Harvey, Samir Amin, and one of the leading Chinese professors who was also, I think, deputy director of World Trade Organization at some point, and is advising Xi Jinping. And they all did discuss this. The question was, is China an imperialist power? So it was all open, very openly discussed. People joined, and probably the Chinese guy came closer to saying that, without using the term imperialism, China is an imperialist power. Both David Harvey and Samir Amin saying that no, in order to be imperialist, they have to change this and this, and so many things.
Yeah, and it is difficult because many of the Chinese, put it this way, one of the definitions, part of the definition of imperialism is the export of capital, classic definition. Lenin's work everywhere, export of capital. Does China export capital? Of course. I mean, what is all this about the Belt and Road and all this trade and stuff? But there are problems there. In what respect? There are most of the corporations abroad, the multinationals, are state-owned. Now, what difference does it make? It makes the way, for example, they acquire an asset. They just acquire it outright. They don't shed labor. They don't get rid of people. In fact, they are more pro-growth locally. I haven't done. I cannot answer this question, but I see that the way Chinese capital is expanding is definitely not the same the way American capital or European or German capital is expanding. It's not the same. It's not, if you like, also culturally the same. Cultural influence. The Chinese will go and set up they do it, although they're blocking them now. The Confucius Institutes, don't they? Cultural imperialism would call it, but I mean, compare this with McDonald's. Do you understand, see what I mean? Or other cultural products America has produced, you know? I mean...
Ksenia, your question.
I can go with second.
Okay, Nina.
Oh, well, I mean, just on that, how about calling it, yes, it's imperialist with Chinese characteristics?
You can do easily, no problem.
But, I mean, I just have a question about, and this is something that's been coming up a lot, how strong is China, the Chinese economy? Because there's a lot of discussion now about how whether it's peaked, you know, there's now lots of issues, the demographics, a whole load of factors there, and it's not helped by all this pressure coming from America. So, you know, what kind of, how the Chinese elite is going to respond to that kind of decline. They'll probably get more nationalistic and more aggressive and so on and so forth. But, so that was one point. The other point was just to pick up on Imran's point that, you know, I think you're not the only person who thinks we're in the opening salvos of some kind of world war. Maybe it's going to be decades, sure. But yeah. And why isn't there an anti-war movement? I mean, I keep asking myself this. It's really sad. And that's something that does really worry me. I mean, you know, in the 70s, Vietnam and so on and so forth, and we had all these, Bertrand Russell, you know, mega people leading these kind of peace movements and so on, and that no one's speaking against this potential war. You know, everybody knows it could end up in World War III. So that's the other question I keep asking myself. And the third thing is, maybe you don't want to go into it now, but you started out by talking about the decline in rate of profit and so on, the stagnation of the West since the global financial crisis. Well, so how's this, and then we went on to the the geopolitics of it. So how is this geopolitics going to help reverse the stagnation? I mean, are you saying rearmament is going to do it? Is it the technology, new technology that comes with the green environmental revolution that's going to do it? Just exactly, what are the links there?
Yeah.
I mean, because otherwise, why did you open with that? Is there a connection?
Yeah. I will start from the last one. Interesting point. Many realists in international relations and in political economy will completely dissociate geopolitics from capital accumulation. Put it this way, capitalism. And I'm trying to connect them, and I think that it's capital or its stagnation, its crisis, is driving geopolitical dynamism and geopolitical projects and security issues. For example, if you ask a realist geopolitician, they will not make any reference to capitalism. They will not. They don't consider that. I mean, who is the classic? I keep forgetting his name. Who wrote about the Mackinder? All this you read is so wonderful about Eurasia, the heartland theories and all wonderful stuff. I'm really going to learn a lot of it. But it's like bones without flesh. What I see is happening is that in the 70s there was a major, and we'll agree to that, major crisis of overaccumulation, a major stagflation, we'll call it. Stagnation accompanied by high inflation. Completely dead. And what made the Western economy to get on the move again was the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, the neoliberalism, right? So privatizations, expansion of financial capital, liberalizations, banks became private, everything becomes private, public utilities became, everything is becoming private, everything, the whole public sphere is being invaded by the private interest, by private capital. So that what has changed, and that is driving the new international orders and reshape international orders because of this new push by capital to expand. Capital can never be confined into a capitalist capitalist state alone.
But it's not expanding, it's pulling out of China.
No, it's China. Well, it goes back and forth. But when I see capital wanting markets, want these European markets, they integrate the European Union, integrated Central Europe, Eastern Europe. This is capital space for capital. They dismantle the socialist state or communist state, call it whatever it was, state. They dismantle the state economy. Right? And the private capital and that was free. The expansion of free market capitalism is the open door theory of the United States since the late 19th century. Open door policy. Remember that? Open door. We discussed it in our work. So open door is still pretty much in place as policy of the United States. Open door. If Saddam Hussein had opened the door for the oil market, it probably would have been there. So what I'm trying to see is that geopolitical expansion is driven by capitalist expansion on a free market basis, and they reach at the border, the confines of a state that cannot control politically anymore because this is Russia. Also, it hits the Chinese world because they cannot control the Chinese state. Chinese state, now I'm coming to the first question, Chinese state has problems, many problems. One of the problems it has is, for example, getting the yuan becoming the global currency. Why? Because they still have capital controls. But without capital controls, we'll lose that state power, And although it goes up and up slowly, yuan, it's still behind the dollar, it's behind the euro, behind and so on. But I think they will keep it. They will hold onto the capital controls and so on. Yes, there is no capitalism is perfect, but still the majority of economy is state is highway. If you ask what is the status of highway, is it public or private? In fact, we don't know, but I believe it's behind is state in the state-owned enterprises in China as.
Huawei is supposed to be a private company, so if
Yeah,
you're saying it's not,
theory.
then that's what the Americans say. That
Yeah,
it's,
well,
it's
I doubt I'm with Americans on that, but you know, at least 60% are state-owned enterprises and the banks. When I checked the Fortune list, for example, the 2,000 bigger enterprises in the world, there were 5 Chinese banks state-owned at the top, 5. Only one American company was the third, I think. The first 2 were Chinese banks. The third was Walmart. And the other 2 Chinese banks, and then there were American companies and others. So the Fortune list, 2,000 biggest business, global. It's a reliable source.
And I think what the correct was, this is not saying that the capital expanding, but that capital is not like US or Chinese, but it's a capital in general.
Yeah.
So it is, whatever happens, maybe one side controlling the capital is declining, but capital itself is moving to new markets, wherever it is going to achieve higher rate of profit. And this is continuing, this is not going backward, this is going forward. In this sense, I think, even though he says he's not Marxist, what he explained is basically, was it in volume 2, Marx talks about capital, saying that the borders or all the restrictions doesn't matter. Capital always finds new geographies, new ways of achieving higher profit. I think it's in volume 2 of Marx's capital.
possibly.
Yeah. Well, in particular,
And 3 talks about trade and all that.
Yes.
In particular, I see this happening when capital undergoes crisis of overaccumulation, which perhaps has become a permanent condition, capital stagnation in the West. I mean, I'm very close to monthly review argument, and probably you are as well. I mean, it's permanent because he wants to get, you know, to revive its own mode of operation and expands. It has no other way to do it, just to destroy, or what is Schumpeter called it, creative destruction. You know, distract and to recreate again new spaces, find new spaces, and coming now to the second question, which is the agency. Where is the anti-war movement? It's very difficult because the conditions, since we had all these public spaces and we can expand within the state. Not within the state in an instrumental way, but we could expand because the state was embracing all society and we wanted even more democracy. We wanted even more. I remember when we were going to, every almost day we were going to the Department of Education, the Greek Ministry, when we were a student, campaigning for more money for education, right? And it was at the time we were asking for something like 10% of GDP to be spent on education. Now they don't dare to ask not even for 0.5%. And there is about to privatize the universities and education in Greece. There is nobody lifts a finger. Why? Because everything around is private. Everything around is getting worse and worse.
But isn't this similar to what
Gramsci
said in 1930? So that morbid symptom things. Because 1970s was not the interregnum period. I mean, we are now in the interregnum period, very similar to 1929-30 period. And Gramsci says, and I think later on Polanyi also wrote about this, in these periods, if the left-wing and radical movements are not organized enough, then the extreme right and extreme conservative individuals and movements use this to organize themselves. This is happening in Italy in his time, in Germany, And now I think it is, situation in my opinion is very similar to that period. All the left, social democracy, socialists are so divided, so disorganized everywhere in the world. But the right, if you look at the extreme right, is getting stronger and stronger everywhere.
And it's partly responsible the social democratic left for that, because it changed completely the discourse from a class-based discourse and went into all sorts of other things.
The foreign minister, Green foreign minister of Germany.
Germany, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary to see, you know, I mean, the adoption of a discourse about rights, which is a direct influence from liberal theory, from classic liberal political theory. They injected it into social democratic discourse. Let's not talk about communism here at all, or communist parties. It's a different ballgame. But major social democrats, the big parties in Europe, all the social democratic parties, completely forgot about the social base, the class base. And it developed a discourse which everything is progressive but the working class. I mean, yeah, it's but the working class.
That's why you get the working class in the States, or large parts of it, are supporting the extreme right, supporting Trump.
And Brexit, and here,
in this country.
Here. They lost their base. As if and they're responsible for that. I mean, Varoufakis in Greece was doing the same. Was trying to open went to BBC. I was reading this morning BBC, you know, on the website, and it says an interview in Turkish elections. Who's going to? And they wanted to promote Kilimanjaro things. And what did they try to do? One of the narratives they developed was we walked into Erdogan commands the thing, is charismatic and so on, but but there is a big problem in Turkey. And they walk into a cafe and they find two boys with earrings and they were the rainbow movement and they will have no freedoms anymore. So Turkish society, they didn't start. They're gonna go and vote Erdogan. They don't understand. They don't understand the society. So they lost touch with society. They tried to do some, how is it called, window dressing, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Society is different, and you lost it.
It's become neoliberalised, the left. Yes. It's not just the social democratic left, it's become neoliberalised, so it sees everything in terms of individual rights rather than collectivities. Everything's about breaking down collectivity.
Watch the discourse developed by the Italian Prime Minister. What do you think she got in? She went and said, you talk about parente uno, parente due, no, c'è mamma e papa. That's it. When the Italian is mamma e papa, that's what we're going to vote. Mamma and papa. Not going to vote parente uno, parente due, you know.
Erdogan talking exactly the same.
So, do you understand what I'm saying? And when you say parente uno, parente due, you're on the left. How can you, my father or my sister, identify with this? You think they all made this cultural revolution somewhere here in their grave, you know? They became so liberated, whereas they met a post-communist society, because these are questions that came in a post-communist society. Not now.
And we kind of claim that by using intersectionality analysis, we are bringing all this together, but it is too complicated for the majority of the people even to follow this argument.
Everybody talks about rights, but not the right of people to have a job. Workers' rights, you know, classical, they are Marxist, Ismail, 1000% are Marxist. Working class rights. We're going to talk about working class rights. The rights has everybody except the working class. This is it. You know?
One more last question. Anybody before
you had a question?
Well, maybe someone else knows.
Okay. Anybody else? Sharmin? No.
Okay, I just wanted to say that maybe when we put the graph for Greece,
where is it?
It's also your graph when ship owners dominate LNG market.
Yes.
It's also
Yes.
very interesting to dominate the terminals, and you can trace all the terminals, most of them,
Really?
China.
Really?
So, and it's very interesting what's happening. They were trying to block it some way. Also, a very interesting book to read. I'm sure you've read it, by Chris Miller, Chip War. Those who are interested in all
Chip
this
War.
US.
Chip War.
And it's bestseller, yeah. And another thing which is also interesting, you talked a lot about inflation and why, and actually that inflation, especially in the energy markets, and inflation which starts and kicks in the energy markets actually spills over to other sectors. It started well before the war in Ukraine, and another book which is also very interesting by Daniel Yergin, where he states that when you go to this transition to green energy, you should first actually develop this green energy before you stop and cutting investment in other sectors and producing sectors, because he calls it something like preemptive underinvestment, the cause of inflation. And if you look at the graph
Correct.
of the gas spike,
Correct.
it starts well before 2022. Yeah, that's also. Also in your real wages in the Asian sector, Japan is not there because Japan real wages are going down.
In line with the Western.
The government is actually in Japan's trying to persuade companies to pay their workers more.
Yeah.
So because that's their vision for expanding, trying to get the economy out of the same the stagnation which the rest of the West has suffered since 2007, 8. In Japan, obviously, they've been in that position.
I think because even though it's still the dominant language, I'm sure Mina knows this better in terms of how to deal with inflation, is using with the interest rates. But a number of countries, including you mentioned Japan and the UK now, they are using other methods. Like, for instance, to put the top on the heating bills. I mean, this is basically price control. I mean, a number of countries are now introducing more and more price control, or trying to increase the wages. So, doing this, even though mainstream economists still talking about playing with the interest rates, but everybody realizes it's not working.
Japan's still trying to increase it. Japan's in such a bad state that it's not got I don't think it does have the inflation that the rest of the West has. It's still trying to reflate its economy with inflation. It wants to have inflation.
And another thing that what's happening in China's economy is also a very interesting thing, because no one will be able to answer, and I think it's actually a wrong approach to be answering at a moment in time when there are lots of trends and things happening at the moment in China. So it's very difficult. What is like short-term effect and what we'll see in the longer run. And what's happening, they learn a lot from what Russia's done under sanctions and under all these pressures. There is such thing as also trilateral commission, as you know, set in 1973 to set up this connection between Western Europe, United States and Japan. And they were discussing a lot about what's going on in China. Actually, China normally is invited, but this year, last year, they were not traveling because of COVID restrictions. But what is interesting that they completely kind of undermine the thing. They argue against what governments want one thing. For example, they all set this target of decoupling from China, but businesses do the opposite. It's again in your discussion of capital flows where it flows. You can't stop it. It needs to run in order to stand still, right? So it does follow where the most profitable thing, and it's very difficult to decouple from China. And everyone in the East and their neighbors realize this. They kind of play the game of rhetoric, supporting the United States with all this kind of a military integration across the region. But businesses are much more.
And we haven't even talked about at all about the amount of debt the Chinese, American debt the Chinese have, and the Japanese, and the Saudis, they call it American debt. You know?
But they already trading. They said the Shanghai
Shanghai Cooperative Organization.
Then, yeah, and also oil trade between China and Saudis happening in yuan.
How is this going to end up? I don't even know.
So we'll see in 10 years.
It's a very interesting quote that Hillary Clinton said. Somebody was asking a lot when she was in power, why don't you do something to put pressure on the Chinese? And she says, you can't put pressure on your banker.
One last question. What have you got about the volume of trade growth all over the world? Is it increasing or decreasing?
I don't have that data. You should have asked me Ismail before.
I think the rate of growth has fallen.
It's not the rate of growth, the amount of, the value of the whole trade. Because if it is decreasing, we are definitely facing a war, major war.
But what is the
Because
time
it has
frame?
happened before. When the trade did not commence, it did not happen, then the war came afterwards.
The trend which I looked recently, China-Russia trade levels are going up, for obvious reasons, because Russia now is moving closer to China in terms of economic cooperation. You may see two different blocks developing. I don't have.
I mean, I think the point about it's very difficult to decouple is the crucial thing. So I don't think it's going decreasing. And also I keep noticing that, for example, you know, some company has moved its operations from China to Thailand. And if you look at who's producing it in Thailand, it's a Chinese company.
Lots of Chinese companies are investing in Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And Vietnamese are so happy.
It makes sense, they are
We
next
are a
door
happy
there.
country.
Yeah, they're in Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
they're that part.
This is a big
De-risking.
integration. It's the biggest integration, the strongest block in terms of FDI between USA and the European Union. It's 2.5 trillion.
But surely that's, I mean, the fact that it is difficult to decouple and all that, maybe we can end with a positive note.
Except before the First World War, famously, the integration between Britain and Germany was high.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to stop here now. Thank you again
You're
for
welcome.
this amazing
Yeah, thank you.
presentation and all
Was
the
it
information
okay?
you provided us.
You. Thank you.